The winter had come too early that year, slanting down from the mountains in a mean sweep that cracked the earth and shuttered the small church doors tighter than usual. Folks muttered that it was the coldest they'd seen since '78. But for Mercy Haller, it was just another stone weight laid on top of all the rest. She sat on the frozen stone steps of St. Luke's, a thin shawl gathered at her shoulders, her black dress long since turned a soil gray. Her knuckles were chapped raw from holding her palms out, open and trembling, to parishioners who stepped over her skirts without meeting her eye. Sometimes they'd toss a copper penny into her lap. Sometimes they'd cross themselves, as if her ruin might stick to their Sunday best. Once, Mercy had stepped through these doors in silk gloves. Once, she'd stood at this altar, saying vows with a rancher who'd built fences that ran straighter than the preacher's spine. Samuel Haller. He'd died with half his boots still in the stirrup thrown by a spooked roan on a dawn ride. Folks said he should have never been out in that storm. But a man can't watch his herd drown in flash flood and keep to bed. After they buried him, the ranch went up for taxes, quick as an outlaw's draw. The neighbors took the cattle. The land reverted to the bank. The house, the one she'd scrubbed raw with lye soap and hot tears, now sheltered a fat banker's brother. She'd begged them for time, but they'd looked past her, polite as they stripped her cupboards bare. So Mercy ended up here, on the cold steps of God's house, palms out, skirt hem stiff with frost, her eyes staring at the stained glass that once warmed her when she still believed her prayers could touch the rafters. Sometimes the pastor would pause in the vestibule, watching her through the leaded glass. Once he left her half a loaf of bread on the steps. She didn't thank him, didn't have the voice left for it, didn't have the heart to lie and pretend she'd come for salvation. She came because it was the only stone porch where no drunk would drag her away for sport. Not under the carved eyes of the saints. Not yet. On this day, when her breath hung like a ghost before her face, the church bell tolled noon, echoing across the yard to where a single horse and rider waited under a leafless elm. He was half-shadowed under the brim of a battered hat, his coat hanging open to show a revolver, snug in a worn leather holster. A dust-brown Mustang shuffled beneath him, breath pluming like smoke. Mercy didn't notice him at first. She was studying her hands, counting the cracked skin, wondering if she should walk to the river tonight and slip her bones beneath the black water. She wouldn't beg tomorrow. She'd be done. But the horse whickered, and she looked up straight into the eyes of a man who didn't glance away. He didn't shift his boots like the rest, didn't mutter a blessing and pass her by. His gaze pinned her there, her ruin, her grief, her empty palms, and he didn't flinch. He dismounted, boots crunching on the frost, spurs soft as whispers. She thought he might be another who'd demand payment for bread she couldn't afford. She braced for it, the shame, the bargain. But he tipped his hat instead, voice low. Gravel broke. "Ma'am, cold day to beg." Mercy only managed a nod, her throat too frozen to answer. "Got somewhere warm?" he asked. She shook her head. He studied her a moment longer, then offered her his hand, rough, scarred, bare to the winter air. "Come on then," he said. "No woman belongs on stone steps. Not today." And Mercy Haller, the widow who'd lost everything but her name, placed her cracked hand in his and rose up from the church steps for the first time in too long. Mercy's legs were stiff as iron rods when he helped her stand. The hand he offered was rough as a corral post, warm despite the chill. He didn't rush her, didn't drag her up like she was a sack of feed, just stood, boots rooted in the frost, brim dipped low, the weight of his quiet presence shielding her from the stairs that crawled up from the road. He led her toward the Mustang, its coat the color of a dry creek bed mane tangled with burrs. She felt the shame knot in her throat that this stranger could see her skirt hem crusted with street mud, the soles of her shoes near split. She half expected him to change his mind when he saw her up close, see the hunger pressed deep in her cheeks, the widow's bones showing sharp through the sleeves of her coat. But he just clicked his tongue at the horse, untied a blanket roll, and spread it across the saddle horn. "You ride up," he said, voice like a worn fence gate swinging in the wind. Mercy shook her head, dizzy with cold and disbelief. I can walk." He paused. One corner of his mouth twitched, not a smile exactly, but something like a ghost of one. "You can walk," he said, "but I got more horse than you got shoes." He lifted her by the elbow, gentle, steady, and set her foot in the stirrup as though she weighed no more than a sack of winter feed. The mustang stamped once. Uneasy at the shift of weight, she clutched the pommel, praying she wouldn't slide off backward. He swung up behind her like he'd done it 1,000 times, which, maybe, he had. His coat brushed her shoulder, the smell of cold leather and old tobacco drifting around her like a rough blanket. He clucked the horse forward, and the mustang obeyed with a snort, hooves crunching through last night's frost. The church bell kept tolling behind them, though no one came out to watch them leave. Maybe folks peered through lace curtains, maybe they whispered that Mercy Haller had found her ruin's last refuge on the back of a stranger's horse. But no door opened. No mouth called her back. Mercy didn't look over her shoulder. She'd already buried her husband in that town's hard clay. She'd buried her pride beside him on the ranch that no longer bore his name. Now she let herself lean just a little against the man whose name she did not know. They rode past bare cottonwoods that rattled like old bones, past fence posts leaning toward the earth, past fields stripped to stubble, the snow caught in the furrows like shreds of a dirty quilt. The wind found every seam in her coat, but the man's arm stayed braced at her side, a barrier between her and the hard fall. After a mile or so, Mercy found her voice again. It scraped her throat like gravel but rose all the same. "Why you doing this?" she asked, staring at the passing fence lines. He shifted behind her. She could feel him shrug, his shoulder brushing her back. "Nobody should beg on church steps in winter," he said. "Seen too many good women go cold because nobody wanted to look at 'em." He didn't say more, and neither did she. The horse's hooves set the rhythm steady, unhurried, a heartbeat that matched her own ragged hope. The wind bit her cheeks raw, but her palms rested against the saddle horn, warming slowly. She did not know where they were going. But for the first time since Samuel's grave turned hard in the spring thaw, she was not alone. They rode west, away from the town's stone cross and gabled roofs, down a split trail that wound through a stand of black pines. The sky above them was the pale white of dirty wool. Clouds snagged on the treetops. Now and then a crow broke the silence, wheeling overhead like an omen Mercy couldn't quite read. When her eyelids drooped, he nudged her shoulder with the back of his knuckle. "Don't sleep," he muttered. "You fall off. You'll break more than your pride." She felt heat crawl up her throat at that pride, the thing she'd bartered piece by piece on church steps and behind curtain doors. But she bit down the shame and let his words sit. He wasn't mocking, just telling it straight. They broke from the trees at dusk. Before them, crouched at the base of a low rise, was a shack that barely deserved the name rough pine boards, a patched roof, smoke curling from a stovepipe that leaned like it was too tired to stand straight. A rail fence wrapped around a small yard, where 2 goats picked at brown grass under the snow. He reined in, swung down, and tied the mustang to a fence post. Then he reached up and plucked her from the saddle like a sack of meal. Mercy's legs buckled when her feet hit the earth, but his hand steadied her at the small of her back. "Ain't much," he said, voice flat as the plain. "But it's warm and dry." He nudged the door with his boot. The hinges moaned, letting spill a faint heat that smelled of wood smoke, stale coffee, and iron. Mercy crossed the threshold like she was stepping into a memory she'd left behind. Inside was one room, rough plank walls, a pot-bellied stove with its belly red from coals, a narrow cot pushed against the far corner. A battered trunk served as table and seat both, with a chipped mug perched on its lid. No lace curtains, no painted china, no cross on the wall, but warmth. He brushed past her, shrugging out of his coat and tossing it over a chair. Up close, she saw him clearer lines cut deep around eyes that didn't look away, a jaw that hadn't forgotten how to clench against regret. His shirt was mended in 3 places, sleeves rolled to the elbow to show the raw hide of a man who knew fence wire and knuckles both. He moved to the stove, lifted a dented kettle. "Ain't got sugar," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "But the water's hot." Mercy lowered herself onto the edge of the cot. The thin mattress dipped under her bones. She set her palms on her lap and felt how they trembled, half from cold leaving her body, half from all the things she didn't know how to ask. "Why?" she said again, softer now. "Why me?" He poured steaming water into the mug, set it in her hands. The heat bit her palms, made her eyes sting. He crouched before her, elbows on his knees, hat tossed aside to show hair peppered with early gray. "Name's Elijah Crow," he said, voice a rasp that could have been whiskey or loss. "Used to ranch west of here. Used to have a wife too, buried her 2 winters back. Snow took the roof, fever took her. Town looked away, same as they did you. He leaned back, studying her face in the dim light. Figured I'd see if I could stand between the wind and one more woman's grave. Mercy held the mug tighter, felt the ache of warmth seep into her cracked skin. She did not know this man. But in that low cabin, with frost crusting the windows and the goats muttering outside, she knew the shape of his grief. It matched her own. The kettle's steam fogged the single window, blurring the dusk beyond. Elijah took the kettle from her shaky grip when she'd drunk enough to thaw her tongue. He set it back on the stove, the iron popping as it settled into the coals. Mercy's eyes traced the room like they might find something to hold on to. There was little to see: a rusted horseshoe nailed above the door, a coat peg made from a branch, a scrap of oilcloth nailed over a chink in the wall. It was poorer than her old ranch house by miles, but not colder. Not tonight. She caught him watching her, Elijah, with his rough hands flexing open and shut like he was deciding whether to keep talking or let silence do the work. Finally, he lowered himself to sit on the trunk, boots spread wide, elbows braced on his thighs. "You can stay here tonight," he said, voice stripped of anything fancy. "Ain't much more than a roof and a stove, but it'll hold you till you figure your next road." Mercy laughed, a sound that startled her own ribs. It came out cracked and tired. "Next road," she echoed. "Ain't no road for me, Mr. Crow. Not unless I want to stand on corners till my bones rot or the sheriff runs me off." He didn't flinch, didn't soften, just nodded like he'd expected as much. "You're hungry," he said instead. He pushed himself up, crossed to a shelf nailed crooked above the stove. A tin of beans, half a loaf wrapped in cloth, the heel of a smoked ham so small she thought it might vanish between his fingers. He set the tin on the stove, pried the lid with a pocket knife. The smell rose plain but warm. Mercy's belly cramped at the scent. She hadn't eaten a full meal in days, maybe longer. She'd forgotten what hunger felt like when it wasn't knotted tight with shame. He handed her a chipped spoon. She tried to protest, but he gave her that look again, the one that said arguments were wasted words. So she ate, slow, careful, mouthfuls that scalded her tongue and soothed something deeper than her stomach. Elijah leaned back against the wall, arms crossed. He watched her eat, but not like a man taking stock, more like a farmer checking the fence line, making sure it'd hold through the night. When she scraped the last smear of beans from the tin, he crossed to the cot, grabbed a blanket from a cedar chest at its foot. He laid it over her shoulders, rough wool smelling of smoke and pine. "You take the bed," he said. "I'll sleep by the stove." She started to protest again, some leftover scrap of decency wanting to say she wasn't that kind of woman, that she didn't trade her body for warmth. But he held up a hand before she could speak. "Don't look at me like that," he said, voice quiet thunder. "Ain't what this is. I'm too tired to bury any more sins. Got enough ghosts in here." Mercy lowered her eyes. The blanket was heavy on her shoulders. She didn't know what to say to that a man so worn down he'd give a stranger the only bed he had left. She just nodded. He sank onto the floor by the stove, pulled his coat tight around his shoulders. The red coals threw his shadow up the wall, long and bent like a tree in a windstorm. Outside, the snow began again, soft, persistent. Mercy curled on the cot, her palms pressed under her cheek, and listened to Elijah's breath settle into the rhythm of sleep. For the first time since the bank took her roof, she let her eyes close without bracing for the cold. Mercy woke before dawn, the gray hush just starting to bleed through the oilcloth patch nailed over the window crack. Her neck ached from lying curled tight on the narrow cot, but she stayed still a moment, letting the warmth of the blanket weigh her bones down. She heard Elijah's breath, low and steady, broken now and then by a quiet grunt as he shifted in his sleep by the stove. In the dim red glow of the coals, he looked smaller somehow. The hard edges of his shoulders loosened, the hat off, hair pressed flat on one side, like a boy's. For a moment she let herself believe this was her own kitchen, her own man asleep by the stove after fighting off the night's cold. A lie, but a gentle one. But dawn does what dawn does, tears up gentle lies with daylight. Mercy swung her legs off the cot, the bare boards biting cold through her stockings. She found the kettle where he'd left it, poured what water remained into the tin mug, and set it on the stove's open belly to warm. When Elijah stirred awake, his eyes found her already upright, shoulders squared like she meant to stand on her own 2 feet this time. He rubbed a palm across his face, beard rasping. "Could have let me do that," he said, voice thick with sleep. Mercy shrugged. "You did enough." They didn't say much as the morning coals gave up their heat. He threw open the cabin door and stepped outside to toss feed to the goats. The winter wind barged in behind him, raw enough to slice through her shawl. She pulled it tighter and turned her eyes to the wall, where something caught her, a frayed length of rope hanging from a nail, knotted rough at one end. It was nothing at first glance, just a scrap to tie fence posts or lash a gate. But Mercy's eyes saw more than rope. She saw the noose that Town had looped around her neck the moment Samuel's grave closed. Not a rope of hemp, but of rumor, side-eyes, muttered beggar widow, as though grief was a sin that spread like disease. She stepped closer, fingers brushing the coarse braid. Behind her, Elijah's boots thumped back inside. He paused when he saw her touching it. His mouth tensed under the line of his beard. "Use that to tie off the goat's pen," he said, voice careful. "Or used to." Mercy turned, her fingers slipping from the knot. "Feels like more than rope," she said, her voice strange to her own ears. Elijah's eyes held hers, long enough that the kettle on the stove began to hiss behind him. He didn't look away. "I could burn it," he said finally, "if it feels like it's got teeth." Mercy swallowed. Part of her wanted him to. Part of her wanted to feed that rope to the stove's red belly, watch the fibers blacken and curl and lift like smoke through the roof. But another part, the part that had knelt on stone steps, knew some shame didn't burn easy. "Not yet," she said, surprising them both. "Not yet." He nodded once, an understanding more than agreement. He turned, fetched the kettle, poured her the first cup. The steam kissed her cracked lips, and she felt the day settle its cold shoulders outside. There was a rope on the wall, a wound still open. But here, inside the cabin, the coals burned hot, and for now, that was enough. They shared the tin mug between them as the dawn edged its way inside, pale blue and merciless. Elijah didn't say much, he never did, but there was a steadiness in his quiet that made Mercy feel like her own heartbeat might find its old pace again if she just sat near him long enough. After the coffee gone thin, he pulled on his battered hat and shrugged into his coat. He asked if she'd manage alone while he checked the fence line. Maybe barter a bundle of goat cheese with the widow Briggs 3 miles down. Mercy told him she'd be fine. She wasn't sure it was true, but he seemed to know when to push and when to trust, so he nodded, tied his revolver belt tighter around his waist, and stepped out into the blue hush, boots crunching frost. When the door shut, the silence inside pressed heavy. The stove's breath was the only sound, a slow, steady exhale. Mercy stood there a while, staring at the rope on the nail. It seemed alive now, not just cordage, but a memory with a pulse. Restless. She dug into the cedar chest at the foot of the cot. Inside she found an old flour sack, a handful of spare clothes, Elijah's. Judging by the size, and tucked at the bottom, a single folded scrap of paper. She lifted it out, careful as if it might turn to ash at her touch. It was a letter, written in a hand she didn't know slanted, pressed hard enough to score the paper. "Elijah debts ain't buried just 'cause you run west. If you want her grave to stay whole, pay what you owe." No signature, no mercy in the words. Mercy folded it back, throat tight. So Elijah Crow carried ghosts heavier than hers, debts unpaid, a grave threatened. No wonder he'd found her in front of that church. 2 beggars in different skins. She placed the letter back and closed the chest. She could have left just then, taken her thin shawl and the crust of bread left on the trunk, slipped through the pines back to town. She'd slept in a warm bed, filled her belly. That was more than the town owed her, more than it would forgive her for. But her feet didn't move. Instead, she found a broom leaning behind the stove. She swept the dirt floor, gathered the ashes and scraps of bark, fed the stove fresh kindling. She boiled the last of the beans, scraping the pot clean so Elijah would have something warm when he returned. When the chores were done, she stepped outside. The cold bit her cheeks, sharp and honest. She walked to the fence where the goats watched her with yellow eyes. She saw the pasture beyond, the way the snow clung to the wire like frostbite. In her mind's eye, she saw the townsfolk too, their faces turned from her as she'd knelt on stone, their boots sidestepping her outstretched hand. But she also saw a single shape, a small boy with a wool cap too big for his head, lingering on the church steps while his mother tugged at his sleeve. She remembered how he dropped a crust of bread in her lap when no one was watching. Just a child's mercy. A crack in the crowd's silence. Mercy lifted her chin to the wind. That boy's crumb of defiance had stuck. Just enough to remind her not every stone-hearted look could kill her. Just enough to stand here now, watching Elijah's goats nose through frozen grass. She walked back inside, closed the door, and fed the stove again. She was still here. The rope on the wall still waited. But so did she. Elijah returned just before dusk. Boots crusted in snowmelt. A small burlap sack tied to his saddle horn. Mercy heard him before she saw him. The low murmur of him calming the restless Mustang. The creak of leather as he swung down stiffly. He stepped inside, stamping frost from his boots, and paused when he saw the swept floor, the pot warm on the stove, the goats penned tight out back. His eyes flicked to Mercy, where she stood by the cot, the shawl pulled close, her hands raw but steady. "You didn't have to," he said. Mercy held his gaze, a quiet defiance in her spine now that hadn't been there when she'd sat on the church steps. "Didn't figure you'd want to come back to cold ashes." He nodded, slow, a man unused to being looked after. He set the sack on the trunk and untied it 2 cracked potatoes, a twist of salt wrapped in oilcloth, a wedge of hard cheese. Not much, but enough. Enough to prove he'd traded something for her sake too. They ate in silence, the scratch of spoons on tin, the crackle of the stove filling the cabin with a warmth richer than any sermon she'd ever heard inside St. Luke's Parathis. When they'd scraped their plates clean, Elijah sat back against the wall, legs stretched out, hat tipped low over his eyes. After a while he spoke, voice half swallowed by the shadows. "Town's talkin'," he said. "Saw me ride out with you. Briggs says they think I bought myself a whore for winter." Mercy's spine stiffened, shame cutting through the warmth like a cold nail. She opened her mouth to deny, to defend herself, but he held up a hand, rough palm catching the lamplight. "I know you ain't," he said. "Ain't what this is. They don't know a thing about grief, about losing a roof and a name in one hard season." Mercy looked at him, really looked. The man before her wasn't the shape she'd conjured when she first felt his hand on hers by the church steps. He wasn't charity or rescue, not fully. He was just as ragged as she was. A man who'd buried too much to stand tall in town talk. She found herself asking, soft as moth wings, "What happened, Elijah, before you found me?" His hat stayed low, but she saw his throat work around the words. Had a patch west of Cold Hollow. Wife named Ruth. Didn't have much, but the fences were straight. The roof kept the snow out mostly. Came home one night from driving cattle and found her sick. Fever took her inside a week. By spring, the bank came. Claimed I owed more than I could count. Sold the land to a cousin of the same banker that stole yours. He laughed, dry and bitter as dust. "Ain't much new under the sun, is there?" Mercy shook her head. It ain't." They fell quiet again. But the silence was different this time, not sharp like frost, but weighty, shared like the old wool blanket they draped over their shoulders. She glanced at the rope again, hanging limp on the wall. A thought flickered behind her eyes, half-formed but burning slow. The rope didn't just belong to her shame anymore, it belonged to him too. To both of them. Outside, the wind pushed against the cabin walls, testing the seams, searching for a crack. But the fire held, and so did they. 2 broken fences leaned against each other in the dark. The wind did not quit that night. It rattled the loose plank in the cabin wall like an old ghost trying to come inside. Mercy lay on the cot, wrapped tight in the rough wool blanket Elijah had left her. Eyes open to the dark, she could hear him, the steady drag of his breath, as he dozed by the stove. His boots still on, revolver belt close to hand. Now and then he'd grunt low in his sleep, some dream loosening a word or two. Ruth, fence line. Keep warm. Ghost words. Words meant for the dead. Mercy turned her face into the thin pillow, her mind tracing all the roads that had led her here. The grave, the banker's sneer, the church steps worn cold by her knees. She saw her husband Samuel's broad shoulders, the way he'd tip his hat to her, even after 10 years of marriage, like she was still the prettiest sight in the valley. She saw his grave marker leaning under snowdrifts, alone like a stone tooth in the white. Outside, The goats shifted in their pen, hooves scuffing dry dirt. The rope on the wall seemed louder than their stirrings, a coiled whisper in the dark. Mercy pushed herself up on one elbow, blanket slipping to her waist. She stared at that length of rough hemp swinging gently when the wind found the cracks. Something in her chest unknotted a small crack where warmth slipped in. Slowly, she swung her feet to the floor. The boards bit cold up her legs. She padded across the tiny room, past the stove's iron belly where Elijah's breath rose in faint clouds. She didn't wake him. Some ghosts needed their sleep, too. At the wall, she lifted the rope from its nail. It felt heavier than it looked like it carried every whispered rumor, every sidelong look she'd ever worn like a second skin. The knot at one end was stiff with old grease. She turned it over in her hands, fingers tracing the braid, until they burned from the cold. Then she stepped to the stove. She opened the iron belly and felt the wash of heat slap her raw skin. Coals glowed like old eyes staring back. Behind her, Elijah stirred. His boots scuffed the floor. She didn't turn when he spoke, just 2 words, low as a prayer. "You sure?" Mercy nodded, eyes never leaving the flames. "No shame left worth tying," she said. Her voice did not shake. Not this time. Elijah came to stand beside her. He didn't touch her, just stood close enough that she felt the edge of his warmth, rough and steady. Together they watched as she laid the rope across the red coals. It caught slow smoke first, bitter and gray, rising to sting her eyes. The knot blackened, fibers splitting like old wounds, hissing as they curled in on themselves. For a heartbeat, the cabin filled with the stink of burnt hemp and old sins. Then the rope dropped into orange and was gone. Outside, the wind slammed the wall, searching for a way in. Mercy closed the stove door with a soft clang and let her shoulders fall. The rope was ash now, the knot unknotted by fire. Elijah's hand hovered at her shoulder, rough palm just brushing wool. He didn't speak, didn't need to. They stood there, side by side, breathing in the smoke of something neither of them would carry come morning. By morning, the rope was nothing but a faint scorch mark inside the stove's iron belly. Mercy opened the door at dawn and stirred the ashes with the poker, watching the black flakes drift among the red coals. The knot was gone. She breathed the air in that drafty cabin like it was the first honest lungful she'd drawn in years. Elijah moved behind her, shoulders brushing hers as he set a kettle on the coals. He did not speak of the rope, didn't need to. Some sins you bury once, with fire instead of dirt, and the memory keeps its own silence. They ate the last of the potatoes boiled soft in salted water, split the wedge of cheese between them. No feast, but Mercy's belly was warm, and that was enough for a woman who once thought her skin might never feel warmth again. After breakfast, Elijah pulled on his coat and hat. He checked his revolver's cylinder, the dull clink of metal sounding louder than any sermon. He jerked his chin toward the door. "Walk with me," he said. Not a question, an offering. They stepped outside. The wind had died overnight, leaving a hush so deep it felt like the world was holding its breath. The goats nosed around the yard, steam puffing from their flanks. Beyond the fence, frost painted the pasture silver. At the far post of the fence line, something new waited. Tacked crooked to the splintered wood was a scrap of stained paper nailed with a rusted spike. Even from the porch, Mercy could see the bold scrawl, "Pay what you owe, or the grave won't hold." Elijah's breath came out slow through his nose, fogging the air. He didn't move. Mercy stepped off the porch first, skirts brushing frostbitten grass, boots crunching old snow. She stopped in front of the sign, staring at the words like she might stare down a rattler coiled at her feet. When Elijah came up beside her, he didn't curse, didn't spit. He just stared at the threat nailed to his fence. A dead woman's rest dangled for a debt unpaid. Mercy felt something old in her crack like a dry branch. Maybe once she'd have turned away, pretended the sign was someone else's shame. But not after the rope, not after ashes and coals. She reached up, tugged at the scrap until the nails squealed free. She held it in her palm, feeling the weight of a threat made by cowards who wrote with ink instead of facing a man's eyes. "You want it gone?" she asked. Her voice was flint striking steel. Elijah looked at her, really looked. He saw the woman who'd sat silent on church steps. He saw her hands now, steady and cracked but not trembling. He nodded. "I reckon it don't belong here no more." So she turned to the stove, still humming heat inside the cabin, and fed that paper to the coals same as she'd fed the rope. The flame caught fast, curling black around the threat's ugly scrawl. For a moment, Mercy thought she heard Samuel's voice in the pop of burning ink, a grave's only home, if it's left in peace. When it was gone, she shut the stove door. Behind her, Elijah leaned against the wall, arms crossed. There was something like the shape of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, cracked but real. Outside, the pasture stayed silver, but the cabin's walls felt stronger than the frost. They had burned rope and threat both. The grave would hold. So would they. They didn't speak of it again, not the rope, not the threat nailed to the fence, not the grave that some coward wanted to ransom for a debt long past due. Instead, Elijah saddled the Mustang and rode to Cold Hollow to speak to the sheriff himself. Mercy stayed behind in the cabin, tending the goats, patching a hole in the lean-to roof with scrap burlap and nails that bent more often than they bit. When he returned, dusk was leaning its elbows on the hills. He looked tired, not the kind that sleep could cure, but the kind that sat deep in a man's ribs. He unsaddled the Mustang slow, fed it a handful of grain, his hands moving calm like he was telling the world he still owned his own bones. Mercy met him at the door. She didn't ask what the sheriff said, didn't need to. Some debts died when you stopped paying them with your fear. Some graves kept their peace when the living stood up taller than the stones. That night, she found a scrap of rough pine board behind the woodpile. She sat at the trunk under the cabin's lamplight, a dull carving knife in hand. Slowly, she scratched her name into the plank, Mercy Haller. Below it she carved another, Elijah Crow, and below that, one word more, ashes. It wasn't fancy, just a few letters cut rough enough to catch a splinter. But when Elijah came in from feeding the goats, he saw it resting by the stove. He picked it up, thumb tracing the letters like a man reading a prayer for the first time in years. "What's this for?" he asked, voice low. Mercy stood from the trunk, wiped sawdust from her palms. She looked him straight in the eye. "Proof," she said. He tilted his head, waiting. "Proof we burned it," she said, nodding toward the stove's warm belly. "Proof we took what they tried to hang on us and fed it to the fire. No banker, no sign, no gossip in town can take that from us." Elijah set the plank on the mantel above the stove, crooked and splintered and true. A sign not for sale, not for barter, not for threat, just theirs. A grave marker for all the shame they'd buried in flame and ash. Later, when the cabin settled into its hush, they sat side by side on the cot, the blanket pulled across both shoulders. She could feel his breath warm against her temple, smell the wood smoke tangled in the wool. They did not touch hands, not yet. The world still needed mending before tenderness could come easy again. But the warmth between them was its own quiet vow. Outside, the wind prowled the cabin's seams, found no way in. The goats huffed in their pen. The pasture held its frost. But inside the stove's coals burned low and red, the proof of what had been given up and what would never be taken again. Long after Elijah's breath eased into sleep, Mercy sat awake, eyes tracing the carved sign above the stove. 2 names, and the word ashes, a scar burned clean into pine. A reminder that some shame can't outlive the flame if you're stubborn enough to stand beside it. When she finally lay down, she let herself wonder, not hope, not dream, but wonder what it might mean to plant something come spring. Maybe a garden behind the goat's pen, maybe potatoes, beans, a rose, if the soil would forgive her. She closed her eyes to the hush of the coals. Somewhere, a stone grave held her husband's bones. Another held Elijah's Ruth. And here, this rough pine cabin held 2 battered hearts that hadn't gone under yet. And if any soul came riding with rope or thread or rumor, well, they'd find ashes waiting. Proof enough. Some stories burn quick and die with smoke. Some leave a mark you can run your thumb across years later, rough, splintered, and honest. This one leaves you with that plank above the stove. A name, and the word ashes. May you remember it. If ever the world tries to nail your shame to a fence line, may you feed it to your own fire and keep what warmth you can. That's all any soul ever owes the wind.